I'm Francis Levy. Edna Session and I co-directors of the Philoctetes Center, and welcome to our panel, hi Vito, on Frank O'Hara. Before we begin this evening's event, I just wanted to call your attention to the art on the walls. This is one of the last times this show is going to be up, and it was art shows at Philoctetes relate to panels that we have had, and this one was from the WPA to the NEA, in which we had the NEA chairman Rocco Landesman and others to talk about arts funding. So it's really a fascinating panel. Sometimes people think that the art is decoration, and they're not, because there's so much content here. But if you look, this is Peter Siss's work on the wall here, and there's this wonderful work by Beatrice Coron, and some of it outside too, and Janine Menlove, and all of it is related to public art and the kind of recapitulation of some of the Depression ideas and distillation of them in a contemporary context. So you maybe afterwards and during the discussion today, you may let your eyes wander, but don't ever stop listening to our distinguished guests at the same time. Synesthesia is the concept here. Now, this Sunday we have our classical music program continuing. Stephanie Chase, who's the director of the Music of the Sphere Society, does that program, and she returns with From Muse to Music, Exploring the Craft of the American Art Song. Now, on December 5th, we have a panel, a stellar panel, really, on the graphic novel, the art of the graphic novel. And that panel has Linda Barry, Hilary Shute, N.C. Christopher Couch, Ben Couture, and Françoise Mouly from The New Yorker. And on December 12th, our jazz series, Living in the Musical Moment, continues with Louis Porter and Mark Rossi, improvisational structure for two keyboards. All Philoctetes events, by the way, are available if you go to philoctetes.org, like today's event will be in about 2 or 3 days on our archives. You can see it. It's also simulcast, so if it's a rainy night, you should come. But if you don't feel like you can, then just go to philoctetes.org and you can see it simulcast. And they're also on YouTube. So without further ado, and I also wanted to thank NYSCA, New York State Council on the Arts, and the Department of Cultural Affairs, who have enabled us to have this wonderful roundtable tonight, or discussion. Yes, and there are books for sale in the corner by our guests tonight. So afterwards, you'll be able to buy books. I'm now pleased to introduce Mike Braziller, who's really, I've known him for a few years, and he's the publisher and president of Persea Books. And Persea is a company you should keep your eyes on because it really publishes some of the great literature in America today, and has been very prominent in terms of letting American audiences have an awareness of some of the very, very original American contemporary poets. So without further ado, Mike will moderate the panel and introduce this evening's guests. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Frank. Just one reminder that both our guests will be reading several of their own poems at the end of the evening. Very fortunate to have that. And their books they'll be happy to sign books, and books are available for sale. David Lehman is the author of 8 books of poetry, most recently Yeshiva Boys, and 7 works of nonfiction, including A Fine Romance, Jewish Songwriters, American Songs, The Last Avant-Garde, Signs of the Times, Deconstruction, and the Fall of Paul de Man, and The Perfect Murder. He is the series editor of the Best American Poetry, which he launched in 1988. He edited the Oxford Book of American Verse, as well as anthologies devoted to prose poems, erotic poetry, and poems illustrating traditional as well as innovative forms. He heads the poetry division of the graduate writing program at the New School in New York City. Mark Doty's Fire to Fire, New and Selected Poems, won the National Book Award for Poetry in 2008. He is the author of 8 books of poems and 3 volumes of nonfiction prose, most recently Dog Years, a New York Times bestseller. His work has been honored by the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, a Whiting Writers Award, and the Penn Martha Albrand Prize for Nonfiction. He has recently published The Art of Description, World into Word, a handbook for writers, and is at work on a new prose volume, What is the Grass? A meditation on sex, the body, ecstasy, and Walt Whitman. He teaches at Rutgers University. Well, welcome both of you. And what we thought we would do is I'm going to just throw it out to both of you. You could either make some introductory remarks about O'Hara, biographical or just sort of general. It might be appropriate to do that, and then rather quickly, let's read one poem and try to get to him through the poems or work outward from the poems. What do you think? We can.
Sure. Well, maybe I would want to start out by just talking about two somewhat personal points of connection to Frank O'Hara. I think of our roles this evening as somewhat different, is that David is much more of a historian and I am much more an enthusiast. Not that you are not enthusiastic as well, but you have a fund of knowledge of O'Hara and his period, having written a terrific book about it, and what I have is allegiance. So I thought I would speak a little bit to allegiance to begin. And I want to talk about 2 points of pleasure for me in O'Hara's work that have been perennial sources of energy and delight. And one of them is his pleasure in New York City. A poet who embraced this place, its polyphony, its continuous distraction, its marvelous and exhilarating annoyances, as perhaps no poet before him, really. He comes in a tradition of gay poets who came to New York and found here permission and possibility. I would say Walt Whitman first in that tradition, a young man coming from Long Island and farming community, and then from Brooklyn, and discovering here the great possibilities of anonymity, freedom, risk, the opportunity to rub up against ferrymen and streetcar drivers and passersby in the street, and to find a life not defined by familial roles and familiar expectations, but a much greater sense of possibility emerging in the mid-19th century. After Whitman, I think then of Hart Crane, another young man arriving in New York from Cleveland, and finding here the world, and a great sense of embrace that seems to run counter to a tradition of romantic poets before him who found in the city desolation and human waste and a sense of degradation. You think about Blake describing London and saying he marks in every face he meets marks of weakness, marks of woe. Neither Whitman or Hart Crane see any such thing, but lots of potential dates and a great deal of delight in the physicality of the city and in the exuberant human mix it provides. So O'Hara seems to me to bring that tradition into closer to our part of modernity, and to refresh and revive it. So there's a timelessness about his love of New York, which is so evident in all the stuff, the minutiae of urban life, which is pasted directly into the poems. I often hear from students who say they don't want to put anything which might date their poem, a bit of advertising, some pop phrase. O'Hara clearly has absolutely no fear of dating anything. Everything of the moment rushes into the poem, and the result of that is a sense of timelessness. The other, briefly, I live, when I'm not in New York City, in the Springs, about a mile from Frank O'Hara's grave. It's a place I visit regularly, and I have a funny sense of being accompanied. And I think that sense of accompaniment has to do with the timelessness of this poet. It seems to me that this person is not gone, but is somehow in the next room, because this voice goes on speaking to us in the present tense and informing the way that I see the world. It's part of my spiritual company. So that's a personal place to start.
Well, let me begin by saying how nice it is to see you. It's a really typical New York City situation where we live 4 blocks away, and here's where we meet.
We talk in public, right?
Yes.
Right.
So it's great to see you.
You too.
And like you, I began as an enthusiast about Frank O'Hara, but well before I ever wrote about him. And I think one thing that appealed to me as a poet influenced by O'Hara was that his poetry followed from not silence, but a gregariousness. It was an extension, a natural extension of his gregariousness. And his poetry sounds like someone is alive and talking to you. And that helps account for the continuing vitality.
Absolutely.
But it's balanced with this extraordinary amount of knowingness, cultural reference, blended in with a great deal of awareness of the immediacy of the moment. What the headline is telling him that day, who he's meeting for lunch at Larray's. And I think that he takes the prose materials of everyday life and turns them into lyric poetry, or occasions for lyric poetry. His phrase, Meditations in an Emergency, which is one of the poems that we're going to be reading aloud, a prose poem, and the title of one of his books, is a play on a book of sermons by John Donne, Meditations upon an Emergent Occasions. Upon emergent occasions. He just twisted it with Schuyler's help into Meditations in an Emergency, which seems to characterize New York City, where any meditation you have is likely to be in an emergency. You always feel as if you're in an emergency. He takes the materials of everyday life and also the forms, I think, of discourse, like a journal entry. Meditations in an Emergency, which we'll read, is a prose poem that at certain points sounds like jottings of what he did that day. At certain points, like a love letter to someone. At a certain point, like a love letter to the city of New York and in favor of urban living. And he's also a very funny poet. He takes the poetry out of the academy and brings it sort of into the streets, but without debasing it, if I may put it that way. I don't know if you've been watching Mad Men. One episode in Mad Men ends with Don Draper reciting the last part of Mayakovsky aloud as he mails the book, Meditations in an Emergency, to someone in California, the identity of whom you don't find out for a while. And the sales of Meditations in an Emergency the next day were extraordinary for that old Grove Press book. But it really said something about O'Hara's reputation, that the writers would think of him. And then that all the masses of viewers of that television show have been turned on to Frank O'Hara. And this year we have James Franco in Allen Ginsberg. It's sort of interesting that Ginsberg and O'Hara are so prominent, much more so than Robert Lowell and John Berryman.
And in the new movie of Howell, you can see John Hamm playing the defense attorney in the prosecution trial. So it really is as if Don Draper is standing up for Allen Ginsberg.
It is definitely Don Draper.
It's totally Don Draper.
It is Don Draper.
So I want to pick up on what you said about the poems being addressed to a specific person and having that sense of occurring within an intimate sphere. And I think even if you read the poems of people, wonderful poets I love writing in the same moment. Read Life Studies, read For the Union Dead. You don't have that sense of a kind of direct address, but rather something of the poem being delivered to the world, being delivered to the audience for poetry, waiting to receive it. And one of the perennially energizing and refreshing things about O'Hara is that sense, what he called personism, right? The notion in a kind of half-ironic manifesto, the idea that the poem is always being delivered to one person in particular. And those poems often very literally are. They talk about what Joe and I did this morning, or what Bill and I are going to do this evening. But there is that sense that we are allowed to step into the shoes or the chair of the listener for the duration of the poem. It's an intimacy that somehow has the doors and windows open. I'm not quite sure how that's accomplished.
Well, I'd like to look at it through the poems. I'm very interested in what you're talking about. And I think there's a real purpose to what you just said. That I think he's Again, let's look at it through the poems. Let's try to keep that point in mind of this intimacy you're talking about. It's, to me, there's almost like a slightly, I like to put out there a question there's a slightly political object to that. In other words, there's a sort of us versus them kind of thing. Yep. There's the art scene versus conservative Republican Middle America, and this is a way of sort of asserting something and saying something. I don't think in a contemptuous or in a critical way, but and I think particularly which of the poems is the one, "The Day Lady Died," where he uses a lot of first names, and one of the first names he uses is Miss Stillwater, the banker, and
Miss Stillwagon.
First
name Linda. I once heard.
But he uses famous artists' first names, and then he picks up just somebody he hardly knows, an anonymous, sort of.
But one interesting thing is that some of the people he names who are famous artists were unknowns then. And that's very interesting because his taste is validated. I mean, He talks about Larry Rivers when no one knew who that was, or Jane Freilacher, with a huge following.
Yeah. By the way, who is Hal? There's one poem that refers to Hal.
Hal Fondren.
Okay.
Had a house in Farallon Pines.
Yes, and he was a Harvard friend of his. I mean, he isn't as famous, although O'Hara made his friends famous by naming them.
Yeah.
And his poems are so good that you became interested.
Yeah.
And in That Day Lady Died, he mentions Strega, a liqueur that many people have tried, I think, because O'Hara mentioned it.
That's great.
Also, Gauloise and Picayunes.
Yeah.
Two kinds of cigarettes that the New York Times is against.
And he mentions burgers and malted milk. So this is juxtaposition of sort of very refined high culture, or
And there's a lot of sympathy for Billie Holiday, who in fact was not only this great singer, but was...
well, she's an artist.
And she was hospitalized, arrested while in the hospital her last days for violation of possession of heroin. And she'd been really harassed. I mean, there is a political element in
that's what I mean. Or
poems.
socially, yes. That's what I'm. But let's read that one. Or where are we starting? Which one do you want to start with?
Start there.
That's good. Great. Okay.
It is 12:20 in New York, a Friday, 3 days after Bastille Day. Yes, it is 1959, and I get off the 4, the 5, and I go get a shoe shine, because I will get off the 5:17 in East Hampton at 7:15, and I don't know the people who will feed me. What did I leave?
And then go straight to dinner.
And then go straight to dinner, and I don't know the people who will feed me. Why don't you do the next stanza?
I walk up the muggy street beginning to sun and have a hamburger and a malted and buy an ugly New World writing to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. I go onto the bank and Miss Stillwagon, first name Linda, I once heard, doesn't even look up my balance for once in her life. And in the Golden Griffin, I get a little Verlaine for Patsy with drawings by Bonnard, although I do think of Hesiod translated Richard Lattimore, or Brendan Behan's new play, or Les Balcons, or Les Negres of Genet, but I don't. I stick with Verlaine after practically going to sleep with quandariness.
And for Mike, I just stroll into the Park Lane liquor store and ask for a bottle of Strega, and then I go back where I came from, to 6th Avenue and the tobacconist in the Ziegfeld Theater, and casually ask for a carton of Gauloise and a carton of Picayunes and a New York Post with her face on it. And I am sweating a lot by now, and thinking of leaning on the John door in the 5 spot while she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing. So the poem stops breathing at the same moment in a sort of breathless way, and there's no punctuation at the end. And yet her name is never mentioned, though if you flip the 2 terms in the title, The Day Lady Died, you get her nickname, Lady Day, which was the nickname given to her by Lester Young, who was her favorite tenor saxophone player. And she called him Prez, which is short for president.
It feels like a perfect model of the way that knowledge breaks over us. Especially the knowledge of tragedy, the knowledge of disaster, that one is consumed by the ordinary. You're immersed in the fabric of daily experience and suddenly arrested by that which you don't want to admit, right? That which freezes you, makes everything else suddenly go flying into the background.
Yeah, this is a good example of what he called his "I do this, I do that" poems. But it's very deceiving because it seems at first to be just a chronicle of what he was doing on his lunch hour. But you realize later that he's been extremely precise about the time. Right. And that everything he mentions, which is an incidental detail seemingly of little importance, turns out years later to be vastly informative to us. For example, that there are tellers in a bank will soon be an anachronism.
That's true.
That they were called Miss Stillwagon in our universal first name society might be of interest. That people smoked and enjoyed it. The Ziegfeld Theater, still, that's one of the things that's still there. The Five Spot's long gone. That was a very good jazz bar.
We talk a lot, in poetry workshops, we talk a lot about the control of tone. And it's interesting here that we get like that little stanza about Miss Stillwagon, who for once does not even look at my balance, which is a joke, right? And intended to point to the way this speaker is usually viewed when he walks into the bank. Right. He's a little bit suspicious. And so there's a little comedy in that. And how odd that the poem has those comic moments while it's leading to a very different kind of arrival, right?
Well, one thing that O'Hara does that's really, I think, sensational is he manages to put himself down strategically in a way that makes you love him. And in this poem, My Heart, which is a short poem that I'd like to read, he does this, I think, very, very brilliantly. He has a way of talking about himself, incessantly, actually, but that never seems, it never seems really narcissistic. It's never objectionable because he presents himself so sympathetically. But the poem My Heart is interesting, too, because it's a kind of manifesto. He was writing a lot of poems that seemed to embody convictions or attitudes. This would be one. My heart. I'm not going to cry all the time, nor shall I laugh all the time. I don't prefer one strain to another. I'd have the immediacy of a bad movie, not just the sleeper, but also the big, overproduced, first-run kind. I want to be at least as alive as the vulgar. And if some aficionado of my mess says, that's not like Frank, all to the good. I don't wear brown and gray suits all the time, do I? No. I wear work shirts to the opera, often. I want my feet to be bare. I want my face to be shaven, and my heart, you can't plan on the heart, but the better part of it, my poetry, is open. One gesture that is really interesting is, and if some aficionado of my mess. Now that flatters the reader who's an aficionado at his own expense of my mess. That's a really interesting phrase. It's a very arresting phrase.
This poem, as well as taking me back to what Mike was saying about a kind of political dimension, which I think of in part as the democratization of experience. That what Miss Stillwagon does or doesn't do in the bank, and what I'm buying in the bookstore is just as important a moment as any other. And here, I don't prefer one strain to another. Everything that feeds into consciousness is equally a part of who I am. And that's so counter to the way, to what romantic poetry does, right? Which is to take privileged moments.
Although if Whitman is a romantic poet, it is certainly very much in line with Whitman's idea of I embrace everything.
It's true, but when he's embracing everything, he's doing it to get to oceanic immersion in the rest. He's not likely to tell us, what he had for lunch.
No.
Right. Because for him, if he talks about what he has for lunch, it's the joy of making it part of his own body. It's not just simply that it's there.
No, you find out very little about Whitman, really. I mean, he names himself.
Right, but he doesn't tell you a lot about what he does.
No, whereas Wordsworth actually tells you about how he spent his summer vacation.
and tells you some more about his summer vacation.
Are you thinking of or alluding to the influence of painting in a way, or to sort of process or bringing
Sure.
and his relationship to painters?
Because you think about
artsy?
the way that abstract expressionist painters are interested in the surface and the push and pull of elements on the surface, and every bit of that canvas is intended to be alive and interesting. And there isn't, I mean, you look at a big, rich de Kooning, is there a center? Well, maybe there's a gesture that pulls you in one direction, but there's also that little blue acting up down there. And there's no rule that says your attention needs to go here before it goes there. You're allowed to move in all of that and take it all as being of actually equal value.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Really different than what representational painting with its use of perspective does, right? Which is to arrange things in space, and therefore to move the eye very deliberately in a particular direction and control our way through. Well, you can't read a poem without moving through it in a linear way, or it's very difficult to do so, right? You tend to go from the beginning to the end. But we get these opportunities to linger in all kinds of tones, moments, different registers of experience before the poem stops. And so that does feel akin to that sort of painting.
And of course, O'Hara was a great advocate of painters in general, and specific abstract expressionists, and also pop art practitioners.
Right.
And his generosity was a big part of who he was. And I think that generosity is in his poetry, which is an embrace of the world.
Excuse me, did we mention that he was an art critic, right? And he was
a curator.
A curator, but he wrote criticism. I mean, I published his art chronicles.
That's right.
Donald Allen.
A great book published by Braziller.
Right, that's right. It was a venture book. It's a division that
and he did a great monograph on Jackson Pollock.
That's right. That was a Braziller. Yeah.
And he and Larry Rivers did some wonderful and very funny manifestos for Art News. And he got Schuyler a job at MoMA. But he began by selling postcards at the Museum of Modern Art. And then he became the curator of American painting.
We actually have a postcard seller at MoMA here in the audience among us, so you can plan your future. So, what has particularly been helpful to me in thinking about his relationship to painters is, I think it's Harold Rosenberg who was describing abstract expressionist painting, and his little formulation was that the canvas was an arena in which to act instead of a space in which to represent. Right? So if you think about the painting as representing something that's outside itself, that's a really different thing than going to the canvas and seeing what happens, acting right now. And these poems are so much not about representing an experience which has already taken place, but seeing what happens when I arrive at the page today. And that's why there's so much present tense. It's 12:20 in New York on a Friday. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I'm not sure. It's very rare for the past tense to appear in these poems. I think relatively rare, right?
We do feel the present tense as part of their sort of personality, and you feel that you're there while they're being composed. Yeah. I mean, many people think of writing as being lonely in a dark room, and O'Hara's writing sounds like it's being done while there's a lot going on in the room at that time. In 1950, 55, 60, for a poet to use a painterly model for his poetry or her poetry was a very daring gesture and a very liberating one. That is to say, to take the abstract expressionist and say, well, this could be a model for what I do in writing poetry. It was not what the establishment in poetry was thinking of. They were really worshiping at the altar of T.S. Eliot and the new critics. Tonally and
this present tenseness has been the sort of signature quality of O'Hara's influence, maybe especially outside the U.S. He's been a major force in contemporary European poetry. Polish poetry, as we know it, really wouldn't exist without translations of Frank O'Hara. Or it's that here I am, this moment, composing this poem, and what is taking place for me that lies behind Herbert, that lies behind all kinds of wonderful writing at some remove from New York in 1955.
I went to Warsaw, and there's a literary magazine called Literatura na Świecie, and on the cover is James Schuyler, an entire issue devoted to
Heavenly.
Jimmy Schuyler. And O'Hara is very big. Ashbery, too. They're really receptive, and there was some really interesting poetry being written in Poland.
In one of the poems, we'll read one of the remaining poems. I think he even refutes the past tense, or he says he's not a poet of nostalgia or of some remembered childhood. So he even expresses that idea. Which one is that?
Meditations in an Emergency.
Okay,
Let's do that.
Okay, let's do that. Do you want to read that?
Sure.
Okay.
Meditations in an Emergency. Am I to become profligate as if I were a blonde, or religious as if I were French? Each time my heart is broken, it makes me feel more adventurous, and how the same names keep recurring on that interminable list. But one of these days, there'll be nothing left with which to venture forth. Why should I share you? Why don't you get rid of someone else for a change? I am the least difficult of men. All I want is boundless love. Even trees understand me. Good heavens, I lie under them too, don't I? I'm just like a pile of leaves. However, I have never clogged myself with the praises of pastoral life, nor with nostalgia for an innocent past of perverted acts and pastures. No, one need never leave the confines of New York to get all the greenery one wishes. I can't even enjoy a blade of grass unless I know there's a subway handy, or a record store, or some other sign that people do not totally regret life. It is more important to affirm the least sincere. The clouds get enough attention as it is, and even they continue to pass. Do they know what they're missing? My eyes are vague blue, like the sky, and change all the time. They are indiscriminate but fleeting, entirely specific and disloyal, so that no one trusts me. I am always looking away. Or again at something after it has given me up. It makes me restless, and that makes me unhappy, but I cannot keep them still. If only I had gray, green, black, brown, yellow eyes, I would stay at home and do something. It's not that I'm curious. On the contrary, I am bored, but it's my duty to be attentive. I am needed by things, as the sky must be above the earth. And lately, so great has their anxiety become, I can spare myself a little sleep. Now there is only one man I love to kiss when he is unshaven. Heterosexuality, you are inexorably approaching. How discourage her? Saint Serapion, I wrap myself in the robes of your whiteness, which is like midnight in Dostoevsky. How am I to become a legend, my dear? I've tried love, but that hides you in the bosom of another, and I am always springing forth from it like the lotus, the ecstasy of always bursting forth, but one must not be distracted by it, or like a hyacinth to keep the filth of life away. Yes, there, even in the heart, where the filth is pumped in and slanders and pollutes and determines, I will my will, though I may become famous for a mysterious vacancy in that department, that greenhouse. Destroy yourself if you don't know. It is easy to be beautiful. It is difficult to appear so. I admire you, beloved, for the trap you've set. It's like a final chapter no one reads because the plot is over. Fanny Brown is run away, scampered off with a cornet of horse. I do love that little minx and hope she may be happy, though she has vexed me by this exploit a little too. Poor silly Chechina, or FB, as we used to call her. I wish she had a good whipping and 10,000 pounds. Mrs. Thrale. I've got to get out of here. I choose a piece of shawl and my dirtiest suntans. I'll be back. I'll reemerge, defeated from the valley. You don't want me to go where you go, so I go where you don't want me to. It's only afternoon. There's a lot ahead. There won't be any mail downstairs. Turning, I spit in the luck, and the knob turns.
That's a wonderful poem, and it does so many things. It's a poem of unrequited love, but he characteristically makes sort of uses the bravado of wit to ward off the self-pity below the surface. So I'm the least difficult of men. All I want is boundless love. Who couldn't love the speaker of such a line?
Isn't that line, I can't even enjoy a blade of grass unless I know there's a Subway handy or a record store or some other sign that people do not totally regret life? That's engraved on a railing at Battery Park, I think, right?
Yes, actually it is.
Quite wonderful.
There's a little plaque for O'Hara down there. And that's the right line to use, too.
Absolutely.
Also, the line about it's my duty to be attentive. That's part of O'Hara's sort of program. If there were a program, he's in favor of life, in favor of his time. These are titles of some of his poems. He's not a critic in any narrow sense. In fact, he has a poem called "The Critic," in which he talks about critics as the assassins of my orchards. And at the end of the poem, he said, "Be droll, be jolly, and be temperate." That's what he would like to see in criticism. He's really more an affirmative speaker. This idea of being attentive is also very important, because in his poems, anything can show up. If it's important enough to have made a dent in his consciousness, it's important enough to record. Also, he didn't care if... Well, he didn't. He wanted to be Keats. He thought he had the ability, the imagination, the talent, that he had the loftiest thoughts of anybody going. But at the same time, it was okay with him if the world didn't recognize him as Keats. He didn't make great efforts to publish his poems. He gave away the only copy of things. He didn't make a fetish of his own work or plot how he would have a career as a poet. There was something very authentic in his sort of disdain, really, for promoting himself.
It's a great story about Kenneth Koch finding in a pile of papers after O'Hara's death, and in the papers are some letters and some poems and some rough drafts and some stuff that really hadn't been taken very good care of. There's the only copy of A True Account of Talking to the Sun at Fire Island, which to my mind is one of the great poems of the second half of the 20th century, and it's tossed in there, never published.
Well, and that's a very good example of a poem about being attentive, because the sun is talking, and although the sun is talking to O'Hara, the sun is a model for the poet, and it's my duty to be attentive is almost what the sun is saying at a certain point. He's the object of criticism. He says people will say you're too hot, you're not burning bright enough, you don't put in an appearance one day, and they write your elegy, and the sun is really a stand-in for the poet. Mayakovsky had written a poem in which the sun and he have a conversation. And I think the sun actually outtalks Mayakovsky, which is very unusual.
And does burn him.
Would you like to read that one now?
Great poem.
A True Account of Talking to the Sun at Fire Island.
While David's finding the poem, I'm interested in your reference to Keats, because in the passage we were just looking at, it's my duty to be attentive. I am needed by things, as the sky must be above the earth. I really hear Rilke echoed so strongly in that. Rilke's sense that things require us in order to rescue them from oblivion. That it's when we internalize the objects of the world that we grant them a kind of permanence through their transformation into our consciousness. And those are not two poets you would expect to put together. But there is that sort of beautiful romantic streak in O'Hara, which sometimes seems to almost be obscured by the slapstick or the detritus of contemporary experience. Yet it's always here.
And for a poet as casual as he is, he's very learned. He devours literature.
Right. And when he says, here I am, the center of all beauty, writing these poems, he's serious.
Yes.
He means
it,
right?
That's it.
So, a true account.
A true account of talking to the sun at Fire Island. The sun woke me this morning loud and clear, saying, "Hey, I've been trying to wake you up for 15 minutes. Don't be so rude. You are only the second poet I've ever chosen to speak to personally. So why aren't you more attentive? If I could burn you through the window, I would to wake you up. I can't hang around here all day. Sorry, son, I stayed up late last night talking to Hal." When I woke up Mayakovsky, he was a lot more prompt, the sun said petulantly. "Most people are up already, waiting to see if I'm going to put in an appearance." I tried to apologize. "I missed you yesterday. That's better, he said. I didn't know you'd come out. You may be wondering why I've come so close. Yes, I said, beginning to feel hot, wondering if maybe he wasn't burning me anyway. Frankly, I wanted to tell you that I like your poetry. I see a lot on my rounds, and you're okay. You may not be the greatest thing on earth, but you're different. Now I've heard some say you're crazy, they being excessively calm themselves to my mind, and other crazy poets think that you're a boring reactionary. Not me. Just keep on like I do and pay no attention. You'll find that people always will complain about the atmosphere, either too hot or too cold, too bright or too dark, days too short or too long. If you don't appear at all one day, they think you're lazy or dead. Just keep right on. I like it. And don't worry about your lineage, poetic or natural. The sun shines on the jungle, you know, on the tundra, the sea, the ghetto. Wherever you were, I knew it and saw you moving. I was waiting for you to get to work. And now that you're making your own days, so to speak, even if no one reads you but me, you won't be depressed. Not everyone can look up, even at me. It hurts their eyes. Oh, son, I'm so grateful to you. Thanks, and remember, I'm watching. It's easier for me to speak to you out here. I don't have to lie down between buildings to get your ear. I know you love Manhattan, but you ought to look up more often. And always embrace things, people, earth, sky, stars, as I do, freely, and with the appropriate sense of space. That is your inclination, known to the heavens, and you should follow it to hell, if necessary, which I doubt. Maybe we'll speak again in Africa, of which I, too, am especially fond. Go back to sleep now, Frank, and I may leave a tiny poem in that brain of yours as my farewell. Son, don't go. I was awake at last. No, go I must. They're calling me. Who are they? Rising, he said, someday you'll know. They're calling to you, too. Darkly he rose, and then I slept.
Can I ask you about that ending? Because we've talked about how some of the endings, particularly with The Day Lady Died, how there's a certain, darker or a certain sort of swelling of emotion that, do you detect that there? What is? How do you read that?
The ending?
Yeah. Where's the son going to, and why did he?
The pronoun "they" is really very interesting at the end because it's very ominous, and it's very hard not to read that as a signal of death. The diurnal death of the sun when it sets, which it's not going to do for 12 hours, presumably.
I think that ending is the thing that makes a good poem become a great poem here, because of the sense of mystery, the sense that the son who has been, the great luminary who can come down and bless this poet who's not getting blessed in very many other ways, right? I mean, he's getting the light is shining upon him, and yet it turns out that luminary is also subject to greater powers, that we're all directed or pulled by that which we can't control.
Also, the very last sentence is, darkly he rose and then I slept. Yeah. Darkly he rose. Now, that's a really interesting oxymoronic phrase.
Right.
He rose, either the sunrise or he rose to leave me. Darkly he rose, as if the dark mood can coexist with the
There's
bright
something that happens
countenance.
physically, too, when you're sunbathing, with this sort of the kind of heat and scorch you feel maybe on closed eyes, or the way that darkness and light, impressions of darkness and light can alternate when you get so much sun. And O'Hara was clearly somebody who wanted to go lie on the beach on Fire Island or out on Hal's deck, right? So I imagine him getting sun-soaked and being even a little bit of element of maybe a slight hallucination or hangover working in this. I stayed up too late last night talking to Hal, right? Yeah.
Well, he did do a lot of a lot of
He
drinking.
stayed up late quite a bit. Yeah.
He loved running into the sea.
I have been, for the last 2 years, doing a project with the Audubon Zoo in New Orleans where we're installing poems around, or parts of poems around the zoo, and now on a concrete railing around a planter beside the snack bar, it now reads, "And always embrace things, people, earth, sky, stars, as I do, freely and with the appropriate sense of space," which seems like just a wonderful thing to say in the zoo, as an invitation.
It is a great poem.
It's a great poem. And when you put it in context of a poet who, despite the exuberance of the poems, the way he's writing for a coterie, he also had to be a little annoyed about not being widely read. I mean, he was publishing in poetry. The poems were around, but prizes, major attention are going elsewhere. And think about, these poems are actually quite direct about sexuality. Think about the climate of American culture in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So, he's not going to be handed a National Book Award, right? And so he's aware of that. And so to create your own prize, to give yourself an award from the Sun is just wonderful. Well, thus, frankly, I like your poetry. One of the most charming puns that we can imagine, right?
They're really irresistible.
Totally.
In 1955, W.H. Auden was the judge of the Yale Younger Poet Series, then the most prestigious first book award in the country. And he didn't like any of the manuscripts. But his partner, Chester Kallman, was friendly with James Schuyler, who funneled to him 2 first manuscripts, one of John Ashbery's poems and one of Frank O'Hara's. And Auden chose Ashbery's. Although Ashbery is convinced to this day that Auden didn't really like his poems.
Right.
One of the things that happens that's really interesting is that O'Hara writes the first review of Ashbery's book in Poetry Magazine, and it's laudatory. This is the most important first book in American poetry since Wallace Stevens' Harmonium. Mm. That's quite a claim, and a defensible claim.
That could be true. There's a great story about Chester Kallman, O'Hara hearing him in the Cedar Bar, describing a blowjob at great length, so disgustingly that O'Hara then gave up anonymous sex for a year afterwards. It changed his life. It was graphic a narration. It had to be something.
It had to be really extreme. Auden has a great poem about that particular act.
A Day for a Lay, yeah.
Yeah, platonic blowjob.
Platonic blow. No, the platonic blow.
Oh, the platonic blow.
It's called the platonic blow. Right? Day for Lay is another one. Yeah.
No, I think they're the same.
Same thing? Okay.
It's a ballad. It is really an amazing piece of writing from Auden.
Do you want to pull us back to?
No, I was just wondering. I was thinking about the remark of the awards going elsewhere and the value, and then he's dealing with all these painters. Why I'm not a painter, I think, is a little bit about the dollar price of the way American culture values certain things, and perhaps he's not valued, and also I think one of the remarkable qualities about him, for all of his humor and his generosity and his self-effacing qualities, I hope we're detecting in these poems a fragile self, and I think that's what makes some of them as strong and as complex as you're saying that they are, particularly in the endings, but elsewhere. Right. So that. I'll call it thin-skinned, okay?
The self that requires blessing, that you have to cook up a luminary to anoint you, is one that is at risk in some way, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
You want to do Why I'm Not a Painter?
Yeah, why not? Because we were talking about his concerns with fame or his.
So clearly in Ars Poetica, he's writing an aesthetic stance into being. Why I am not a painter. I am not a painter, I am a poet. Why? I think I would rather be a painter, but I am not. Well, for instance, Mike Goldberg is starting a painting. I drop in, sit down and have a drink. He says, I drink, we drink. I look up, you have sardines in it. Yes, it needed something there. Oh. I go and the days go by and I drop in again. The painting is going on and I go and the days go by. I drop in. The painting is finished. Where's sardines? All that's left is just letters. It was too much, Mike says. But me, one day I am thinking of a color, orange. I write a line about orange. Pretty soon it is a whole page of words, not lines. Then another page. There should be so much more, not of orange, of words, of how terrible orange is and life. Days go by. It is even in prose. I am a real poet. My poem is finished, and I haven't even mentioned orange yet. It's 12 poems. I call it Oranges. And one day in a gallery, I see Mike's painting called Sardines. It's great.
That was the first O'Hara poem I ever read and loved. It was in the Donald Allen anthology. I was a freshman in college, and at first the charm of it was that it was so casual and that it made the making of a poem or a painting seem continuous with the most casual living of your life. But only later did I realize it's a little parable, that the poet begins with a color symmetrically with the painter beginning with a word, but then they cross in a rhetorical figure known as the chiasmus, where the painter beginning with sardines ends up with something that lacks anything but a few letters.
Also, he says, he doesn't say it was called Sardines, and he capitalizes sardines, so it's a little unclear whether there were sardines there or whether there were the words that said sardines. I mean, so that there might have been letters.
There are letters.
Yeah.
Well, we've seen the paintings surfaced and has traveled in different exhibitions. Mike Goldberg was around until just a year or two ago, and it's SARD.
That's right. Yeah.
But the idea is that, first of all, you don't, in abstract expressionism, have to be faithful to your source of inspiration. That is, if sardines inspires you, there's no requirement of being faithful to that in your finished work. The process of creating it will change the work. And also the other parable here is that the poems are made with words, and not with the color. The painting is made with color, line, form, and not with words, so that each medium has its own requirements, even if the inspiration can come from another medium, which is interesting. But you don't get that right away because the poem seems so charmingly by the way. This is what I have to do today. And you wouldn't know from the poem that he actually wrote 12 prose poems called Oranges 7 years earlier. Because you think reading this poem that this is about what's happening today, but he manages to get this nonchalant tone, and he's really describing something that happened years earlier because it fits the parable.
So that nonchalant tone does not prepare us for there should be so much more, not of orange, of words, of how terrible orange is in life. And that now I'm going to go on and write, 12 poems that are still not enough to talk about how terrible that is. There's nothing of that terribleness has yet appeared. This strikes me as naturally a poem that you would have gravitated to, because it's partly it's an ars poetica about indirection. There's a pleasure in the poem carrying you where it does. And so that expression or inspiration comes out of not going right towards the thing, but sort of divagating in some way. That seems like you.
Isn't there tremendous ambiguity? I mean, why isn't he a painter, or is he happy as a poet, or is it nonsensical, almost nonsensical?
No, painters. There's a real lot of painter envy among people of that time.
Yeah. Well, and there's still a lot of painter envy. I mean, you think about Orange. You can muster all of that, and you try to make Orange with that many words. You can't do it, right? You just can't do it. You can indirectly point in that. Towards that set of associations and perceptions that's Orange. But, Zbigniew Herbert says someplace that he has to work so hard to move words like heavy furniture around on the page to try to describe a painting, when the painter does it instantaneously, immediately. and you don't feel all that labor and strain, you know. But for us to make orange is, we could go on forever trying to do that.
I also think that at that time, painting was the sort of universally acknowledged as the supreme art, or the
It's heroic.
heroic, and in the forefront of change,
Yeah.
the leaders of the avant-garde.
Well, and didn't it have more of a price value on it?
Yes. Although, Pollock never
What does not
enjoyed
have more of a price value than poetry? I ask you.
Yeah.
No.
But it is always paradoxical, that a talented writer like O'Hara might be getting $5 or $10 for some of these poems, and they might be of equal aesthetic value to something that's going for hundreds of thousands. And,
Right.
Well, our union has been trying to get the painters to agree to pool all our.
Do you think
it's
that
only fair?
The heroic painting of this era is stridingly masculine too? I mean, de Kooning's big gestures, and Pollock, and the women, John Mitchell, were sort of floating in the background somewhere. So I wonder if there's a little bit of that envy of the admired male, forceful figure.
Undoubtedly, they had, you mentioned Harold Rosenberg, and also there's Clement Greenberg, and these guys wrote up a case for the abstract painters boy, it would be great to have been written up about like that.
That's what you want as a critic who's really
Harold Rosenberg called them the action painters. Wow, that made them like the Albert Camus of
and Life magazine is right there.
With Pollock looking like a gas station attendant.
Right.
Which really improved the gas station attendant's image,
But we have, I think, one more.
We do. It's in four parts.
We have the Mayakovsky. Am I forgetting one?
No, that's the one.
And we want to leave time for some O'Hara-esque or slightly influenced or
right.
It would be
your own.
It would be lovely if we could, because it's so short. Do a poem Lana Turner has collapsed.
That's
what is our time? What is? Does anyone have a watch?
I brought a copy of.
I'm supposed to have a watch. But
Lana Turner Has Collapsed is a poem he wrote on the Staten Island ferry on the way to a reading he was giving with Robert Lowell, who felt that he was shown up.
Right. I mean, Lowell apparently said, well, I didn't write a poem on the way here.
It was all put out.
But I want you to know that David has written a poem, not on the way here, but in the office in the back before this evening. So that's why we really need to read this poem.
I can't find that poem. However, what did I do? What did I do with it?
Back there? It's an hour old, David. It can't be gone.
I've been looking for it even while we talk.
You see, like O'Hara, you don't really care what happens to your poem.
No, I obviously don't. but I'll just make up something on the spot.
Where's that little notebook that you had?
It was definitely on a big piece of paper.
Yes, but I think I eschewed the notebook this one time.
Okay. So, should we read the Lana Turner?
Sure.
What is the time? Where are we time-wise?
I think it's 8:10 in New York.
I think we could do it.
It's tiny.
8:10. Okay.
Oh, it's a great.
Okay, let's do it. Let's do it.
It takes less than a minute. Poem.
Okay.
Lana Turner Has Collapsed. I was trotting along, and suddenly it started raining and snowing, and you said it was hailing, but hailing hits you on the head hard, so it was really snowing and raining, and I was in such a hurry to meet you, but the traffic was acting exactly like the sky, and suddenly I see a headline: Lana Turner has collapsed. There is no snow in Hollywood. There is no rain in California. I have been to lots of parties and acted perfectly disgraceful, but I never actually collapsed. Oh, Lana Turner, we love you. Get up.
That's great.
It's a remarkable poem. It's extraordinary poem. And it's so cool to put that next to The Day Lady Died. Because in a way, it's a mirror of that poem, right? The speaker is moving through the flotsam and jetsam of the moment. He encounters a headline, but his reaction, of course, to it is entirely different.
And that poem has really lived on. I mean, it's not as important a poem as The Day Lady Died, let's say, but do you know that Cal Bedian has a literary journal called Lana Turner? Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
UCLA. I just saw Caroline Forche has some poems in the current issue
of Lana Turner.
of Lana Turner.
What an irony is that?
Yeah, but I'm sure that Cal was thinking of this poem.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a hunch. We could find out.
One of the great regrets of my life is that in the 80s, when I was a temporary office worker in downtown Boston, Lana Turner was at Filene's signing her autobiography, and I did not go. And I remember it to this day, right?
I regret that, too. I wasn't
would
there.
have a story for you. And even in there, there's some little moment of image that behaves very differently, but the traffic was acting exactly like the sky.
Yeah, that's a great line.
Which just opens the poem in an odd way because we have to really work to process that one. Whereas everything else is quite straightforward.
And it's a real New York reference, the traffic. It's a perfect example of the unobjective, non-correlative.
Yeah. And it's a very clear poem because that we, who is that we? We love you. Get up. I mean, we is an insider group who is charmed by Lana's her continual failure, like the mess she makes of herself, the public display. She's the Britney Spears of her moment, and so there's a huge there's an affection and an interest in this mess on the part of O'Hara's peer group.
We have the poem Mayakovsky, and that's one that we could probably read in alternating sections. Would you want to start it?
Sure.
I have sections 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Yes. Okay, Mayakovsky. 1. My heart's aflutter. I am standing in the bathtub crying, Mother, Mother, who am I? If he will just come back once and kiss me on the face, his coarse hairbrush, my temple, it's throbbing. Then I can put on my clothes, I guess, and walk the streets.
2. I love you. I love you, but I'm turning to my verses, and my heart is closing like a fist. Words, be sick as I am sick. Swoon, roll back your eyes, a pool. And I'll stare down at my wounded beauty, which at best is only a talent for poetry. Cannot please, cannot charm or win. What a poet. And the clear water is thick with bloody blows on its head. I embraced the cloud, but when I soared, it rained.
3. That's funny. There's blood on my chest. Oh, yes, I've been carrying bricks. What a funny place to rupture. And now it is raining on the ailanthus as I step out onto the window ledge. The tracks below me are smoky and glistening with a passion for running. I leap into the leaves, green like the sea.
4. Now I am quietly waiting for the catastrophe of my personality to seem beautiful again and interesting and modern. The country is gray and brown and white in trees, snows and skies of laughter always diminishing, less funny, not just darker, not just gray. It may be the coldest day of the year. What does he think of that? I mean, what do I? And if I do, perhaps I am myself again.
Once again, some of these endings are the most affecting, and I think, as you were saying before, Mark, that they make very good poems into great poems, and also in a way, the most often a sadness or some surfaces. And to me, what does he think of that? I mean, what do I? That's a very without being solipsistic, that's a very sort of sad comment upon himself.
And it pushes the question of the mask in the poem, the self-fusing with Mayakovsky into the foreground, makes it really self-conscious. So if he follows, what does he think of that? I mean, what do I? And if I do, perhaps I am myself again. But perhaps I am myself again is not certain, is it? It's, when am I myself as a speaker?
That's why that section is so pertinent to the Don Draper situation, where he said,
exactly.
Who am I? And I'm two persons.
I wonder how many people you see on the street in Manhattan are waiting for the catastrophe of my personality to seem beautiful again. It feels to me like I do that several times a day. Or at least, if not beautiful, at least interesting or modern. Right?
That's, again, that example of an example of how he can be gently self-lacerating in a way that doesn't seem calculating, although it is. I mean, he is a wounded. He talks about his wounds in this.
Yeah. But that's the most complicated tone because it's funny. I'm waiting for the catastrophe of my personality to seem interesting again, beautiful, or interesting or modern. It's comic. It's deeply wounded. It's extremely observant about what 20th century life was like and continues to unfold for us now.
And he refuses to take himself too seriously.
Right.
He doesn't think that he's special in some way. He doesn't. I think the only poet he genuinely didn't like was Lowell, actually, because he thought Lowell was too self-important and pompous in shouldering the history of the world and thinking that he was identified with history. And O'Hara hated criticism, negative criticism, but he didn't care for Lowell. He wrote about Skunk Hour, and in a devastating way, about how he feels like a skunk spying on the people making out in the car. You should feel like a skunk. What is he doing? He's a pervert. It's very uncharacteristic of O'Hara. O'Hara went to the opera with his friend, and they met some other people, and the people they met said, as people always do, that that was a mediocre performance and this and that, and O'Hara said to his friend, let's get away from these awful people. And then he later said, my feeling about bad poetry or bad art, it'll slip into oblivion on its own. It needs no help from me.
Right.
And that's a very good attitude.
Right. Something that we might Xerox that statement and mail it to many a literary critic. Don't you?
I was thinking that there's certain critics who like to say at any given time in history there were only 5 great poets.
Yeah.
And that should be on the gravestone of the critic.
Yes, right.
That line.
Right. Right. Well, yes. I was did a sort of public conversation with a poet last night who said that only 17% of American poetry is worth reading.
Well, that's the soul of a poet there. 17%. He really nailed it. You nailed it.
So, how exactly did you arrive at that figure?
But still, there's always been kind of a general rule. I know as a publisher that don't write about. There's so little space and so little attention. Don't write unless you have something nice to say, because it's
exactly.
You don't need.
Exactly. Why bother?
Right.
Right. Well, but before we have to stop here, I want to recommend a book to people, a book I just love, which is by Joe Lesueur, who was O'Hara's boyfriend, partner for a while. It's called Some Digressions on Poems by Frank O'Hara, and it's one of the most interesting pieces of talk about a different form of criticism. What Lesueur does is to divide his chapters according to individual poems, and he talks about where he and Frank were living when the poem was written, what they were doing, who Frank was dating, what he was thinking about, all the incidents sort of around the poem. And it winds up being surprisingly illuminating and full of life. And it gave me a much better sense of who O'Hara was as a person than really just about anything. I felt like there he is.
It's a good book. I got to read it in manuscript when I was writing The Last Avant-Garde, and he wouldn't let me remove the book from the house.
Right.
I had to come spend the weekend to read that book. He was sharing the house with Patsy Southgate.
Right down the block from me. Yes. And apparently that book was only published, he continued to have his doubts about it, and it was published posthumously because a friend of his, a painter named Robert Harms, said, let's take this and get it to print.
Huh. Well, it's a pity that Joe wasn't around to see it published.
Absolutely. It's a marvelous book.
Yes. I like Joe.
And, of course, another terrific source for finding out more about O'Hara and his milieu is The Last Avant-Garde, which is David's book, which is enormously useful and rich text.
I think it is good.
I was going to ask if you recommended it or not. So
Very good book.
I think the way to go now is for if they would both read some of their own work, and then we can have question and answer afterwards, because if I just get a feeling that would be So have you memorized those?
Well, we could read all
Back and forth?
alternating.
Let's do that. Yeah, it feels energetic. You want to go first, David?
All right, I'll read something very short. It's called Radio. And the guiding formal principle was 3 words per line. Radio. I left it on when I left the house for the pleasure of coming back 10 hours later to the greatness of Teddy Wilson, After You've Gone, on the piano in the corner of the bedroom as I enter in the dark.
Wow.
Now I better write that down while it's still fresh in the
That must be close to a record chain of prepositional phrases. Huh?
You know, I don't want to give my secrets away.
Okay. All right, these chops. Okay, so on 7th Avenue and about 20 or 21st Street used to be the Eros Diner. And if you walk straight across the city headed east to 3rd Avenue, you could arrive at the Lyric Diner. And I love the idea that you could go back and forth between Eros and Lyric. Eros, I'm sorry to say, has closed down.
Isn't there an Eros restaurant or an Eros? There's on 7th and Lyric. I live right where
You read by the
Lyric
Lyric?
is famous.
Yeah, right.
But I on 20th and 7th, I think there's.
Yeah, it used to be.
Yeah.
It's gone. It's gone. It's out of business.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to
That's
report.
Too bad.
Yeah,
That's too bad.
but it appears in this poem, which is called. This is also a tiny one. It's called Apparition. Chilly noon on 7th, and I swear, in the window of the Eros Diner, corner of 21st Street, John Berryman's eating alone, back against the wall, face tilted down toward his meal. Iconic thick glasses glinting like the sidewalk in the cold. Iconic thick beard nodding a little as he lifts his spoon, intent on lunch. So happy that a plate's in front of him, he never bothers to look up at me.
That's a nice one.
Is that true? Well, this happened about 2 years ago.
Oh,
so
okay, so
it was. Well, I thought it was true, but yeah. It's part of a group of poems in which dead poets assert themselves in the present.
Well, I have a poem in my book, A Fine Romance, Jewish Songwriters, American Songs. A nice thing about being a poet when you write a prose book is that if you don't know how to end a chapter, you can write a poem to end the chapter. And in our audience happens to be someone who helped edit this book, Hannah Oberman Brindell, so I want to say hello to that person. Well, now this I think is O'Hara-ish just because, well, it's a cento. You know, a cento is a poem consisting of lines lifted from other poems. In this case, popular song titles. And there's a certain rhetorical trick that I use to conflate the titles, 2 per line. It's called Poem in the Manner of a Jazz Standard. Why it's O'Hara-ish? Well, I think he'd be in favor of the form. Anyway, that's my sense. A poem in the manner of a jazz standard. I've got $5 and my love to keep me warm. I've got the world on a string and you under my skin. You're the cream in my coffee and driving me crazy. You couldn't be cuter and go to my head. Love is here to stay and just around the corner. Where or when I take my sugar to tea, all I do is dream of you, all of you. You took advantage of all of me. Don't blame me or worry about me. It had to be you and might as well be spring. Let's get away from it all. Fall in love, face the music, and dance with me. Let's do it. I got rhythm and the right to sing the blues. She didn't say yes. She's funny that way. I believe in you were never lovelier, my melancholy baby, my shining hour.
Oh, what's lovely.
I feel I can clap for that one because every word was written by somebody else. Every single word. You know.
Can we have a Let's Get Lost sequel?
We could even get Chet Baker to sing it, and you know, Frank Lesser. Get lost.
Great song.
Oh, it is.
And so this is O'Hara. You will see how this is O'Hara-ish, maybe especially at the beginning, and then it moved in a meditative direction, which he probably would have disapproved of. Finally, it's from a group of poems called Theories and Apparitions, and you heard one of the apparitions, and this one's a theory. It's called Theory of Multiplicity. I don't like the laundromat on 16th Street in the winter. The single aisle between washers and dryers, too narrow to allow one to sit down. And the women who work there doing the laundry of others seem to resent one's in the wayness. And why aren't you paying them to do your wash anyway? But in summer, it's fine. You can read on the street in white plastic chairs set out for this purpose, watch people go by, and as I like to do one summer, look into the garden someone made next door on the edge of the sidewalk, spilling onto the pavement. Surprisingly wild, with prairie grasses, a shrubby coneflower, strapping and blousy black-eyed Susan, even a few bees frowsing through it. How do they live in Manhattan? Leaning back on the legs of the white chair, staring into the green, I thought of myself as one of its many viewers. What I knew was this singular aspect, this vantage and this light. But didn't it consist in being seen multiply? Those who did not ignore it in their hurry took it in from the particular height or angle afforded them. And even those who paid no mind must have registered a tumbled blur of periphery. What was the garden but the sum of all that, studied or casual? Perception carried, loved, considered, or regarded. Late in the season, frost probably not far off. Afternoon slanting down from the London plane trees, already yellowed and thinning leaves. Sunlight humming into the stalks. The garden I saw, one occasion of many. And this was in some way an accomplishment, a contribution to the work. It took all of us to make the garden known. No one could assemble the entire vantage we made together. If anyone could, I felt in that moment not dissolved in anything, not selfless, but joined in a layering of singularities. A multiplicity, not God exactly, that theoretical viewpoint, but a satisfying gesture in that direction. The next summer, the garden would be sparse, not well tended, and offer no consolation, though even its diminishment might be said to be one of its nearly endless dimensions. So I could never have written an opening like, I don't like the laundromat on 16th Street, if it weren't for this. Right. It's just like, would have been impossible.
I have a poem that I don't know if you know a fellow named Ken Gordon who has a website called Quick Muse.
No.
Well, he's a Boston-based fellow, and they give you a 15 minutes and some sort of prompt. Mm-hmm. And all your keystrokes are preserved, but you have only 15 minutes and you've not seen the prompt or the quote before. So there's an element of game playing and challenge, which I think of as O'Hara-ish, also the idea of writing something on the spot.
Yes.
And on this occasion, he had Kevin Young and me given the same prompts, and they all had to do with people who had just died. James Brown, Robert Altman, who was the president who pardoned Nixon, and
Gerald Ford.
Yes, Gerald Ford, and
Very memorable president. Yeah.
yes, I met him, and Saddam Hussein also was a casualty of that. So they gave you the four quotes, and they preserve your keystrokes, and then but if you go, and it's still on the website quickmuse.com, you'll see that 15 minutes, the first 8 minutes, there's no writing at all because my mother called, so I lost 7 minutes. But anyway, this is the one that somehow wound up getting to James Brown. The quote from James Brown was that dancing can save the world, or something like that. It was, let's see. the one thing that can solve most of our problems is dancing. So anyway, the real thing. I don't agree that dancing solves anything, except how to differentiate between poetry and prose. The former being to the dance, gratuitous, what the latter is to taking a walk, purposive, according to Paul Valéry, who felt that an artificial rose was equal to or better than the real thing. I love that phrase, the real thing. It makes me think of Henry James's story of that title and the Coca-Cola commercial identifying Coke as the real thing. If I could write an essay on that unusual conjunction of names and facts in 15 minutes, it's because you can do a lot in 15 minutes, such as wash your hands, change the CD from Anita O'Day to Dinah Shore singing Buttons and Bows, and write 25 lines, which for some writers equals their entire daily allotment. Or you can dance. The other day I discovered the beginning of a poem from 1980, handwritten on a piece of paper tucked into my copy of William Gass's On Being Blue. The epigraph was from Rilke, Dance the Orange. There are a couple of lines worth saving. Dance the skeleton on the doctor's desk. Dance the rabbi on one foot explaining the law. Nevertheless, I insist that James Brown to the contrary notwithstanding, there's no point to it, nothing to gain from dancing, and that is the great glory of the dance. Though some might argue that dance does have a purpose as the first step toward mating and the reproduction of the species, a complicated subject demanding more than 15 minutes. But as Ira Gershwin wrote, I'm dancing and I can't be bothered now. It's a very good Gershwin song. I'm dancing and I can't be bothered now.
I don't know that one.
Oh, it's a really good song.
Mark, do you want to read one more?
Sure. Okay.
And then we'll have questions
right.
about either their work or Frank O'Hara's.
O'Hara-ish in the importation of the signage of New York City. It's called Signal. Lost cockatiel, cried the sign, hand-lettered, taped to the side of a building. Last seen on 16th between 5th and 6th, gray body, orange cheek patches, yellow head, name Omar. Somebody's deer, I guess, though how do you lose a cockatiel on 16th Street? Flown from a ledge, into the sky he's eyed for months or years, into the high limbs of the ginkgos, suddenly free. I'm looking everywhere, in the rustling globes and spires shot through with yellow, streaking at the edges for any tropic flash of him. Why should I think I'd see him in the vast flap this city is? Why wander Chelsea when that boy could be up and gone, winging his way to Babylon or Oyster Bay, drawn to some magnet of green? Sense to go south? Not likely. Omar's known the apartment and the cage, picked his seeds from a cup, his fruits and nuts from the hand that anchored him, and now he's launched. Unfindable. No one's baby anymore, but one bit. Think of the great banks of wires and switches in the telephone exchange, every voice and signal a little flicker lighting up. That's Omar now. Impulse in the propulsive flow. Who'll ever know? Then this morning, we're all in the private commuter blur when a guy walks onto the subway car doing bird calls. Decked in orange and lime, a flag pluming his baseball cap. He's holding out a paper cup while he shifts from trills to caws. Not much of a talent, I think. Though I like his shameless attempt at charm, and everybody's smiling covertly, not particularly tempted to give him money, though one man reaches into his pocket and starts to drop some change into the cup, and our Papageno says, "That's my coffee, man. But thanks. God bless you anyway." And lurches, whistling, out the door. Thank you.
If people would like to come up, if you want to be really famous, come to the microphone and say who you are and give your question. It's better for us if you do it that way. If you prefer to do it from the audience, we can capture your question also. But if you'd like to, we'll give you.
That's scary.
Who will dare?
It's scary. I wouldn't go up there.
Who will dare disturb the universe?
Hey,
Who will dare to eat a
somebody
peach?
with a burning question. Yeah.
My cockatoo. I have to be so thankful. Is this working? I said, who's Frank O'Hara? And so we went on Google, and I rediscovered Frank O'Hara. I was so thrilled because sardines, why I'm not a poet, or it brought me back 40 years ago to just around the time that he died, and probably my freshman English teacher, we used to take us down to the Café Figaro to do our poetry readings, probably introduced us. And then I see the book of the lunch poems, and it just brought everything back. Okay. Just fabulous. I have to say, as I was coming upstairs, a gentleman said to me, I don't get it. And I said, it's very important. The Frank O'Hara, who he is, as you say, the madman from the TV show. It's a particular time. I feel like it's a statement being made about Generation X, and we are somebody. We have thoughts. This is what it was like, and there's absolutely no separation between art and politics and my personal thoughts.
Thank you. I don't know why I have this association, but you make me want to say that there is a terrific collection of recordings of O'Hara in that Voice of the Poet series. Is that Knopf? You know the ones I mean, the CDs, right?
Elise Passion put it together, isn't that right?
No, this is just this individual. You can buy one at a time. And there's a Merrill, there's a Bishop, there are lots of different people reading.
McClatchy, the general
Yes, McClatchy's general editor. And there's a terrific Frank O'Hara CD, mostly recorded, in cafes and bars, not fancy equipment. There's crackling and there's glasses clinking, but you get so much a sense of the atmosphere. And on YouTube, there's a terrific little video of O'Hara readings. You can see him in one of these cafe settings. And again, the quality is not superb, but the atmosphere is all there.
So I thank you.
Oh, yes?
I'm not going to get up. You both mentioned tone. I was wondering if you could comment a little on the diction of Frank O'Hara.
Wonderfully polyglot. And we were talking about, or I guess I was talking about this sense of a democracy of experience, that all kinds of perception and feeling could have equal place in the poem. And it feels true to me about language, too, that we can have very casual speech and bits and pieces of French and a literary quotation. And in Meditations in an Emergency, there was that little, I assume that's not a real quotation, that bit of what feels like a little 18th century novel that appears in there.
It must be made up about Fanny Brown.
Yeah, it has a kind of arch camp quality to it. And so this kind of mix of levels of discourse feels really central to it. The best example I can think of that actually is Ashbery. It's that moment when he says, "What lovely antiques, fap, grunt." Like there it is, like kinds of language that are never in the same place. A genteel exclamation followed by some comic book, grunting, is very characteristic of those poems. What else can we say about diction here?
Well, I'm not sure that this is exactly to the point of diction, but Frank used a lot of exclamation points in his poems, and that's not as novel a thing to do anymore, because we have the example of Frank O'Hara, and a lot of people have imitated that. But his poems are very exclamatory, and they were taboo-breaking in a way. The poems were supposed to be very stately, grave, solemn, somber, about the Civil War or the sea. Those were good subjects. And they should be treated in this very plodding way with quatrains.
You left out Roman fountains.
Roman fountains, very important.
Big one, yeah.
And Italian, you have to go to Italy and write a poem about Bernini on your Guggenheim Fellowship. That was an important experience. No exclamation points, though.
Could also add inversion. There's no fear. Things like Go I Must or Darkly He Rose, which would have been seen as pompous or archaicisms. He seems to really enjoy mixing with very casual speech.
He can go from Pasternak or Rilke in one line to Suddenly Last Summer with Elizabeth Taylor at the movies. And this is something Ashbery does a lot, too. There's sort of rapid shifting from quoting Satan in Paradise Lost to a comic book character in the next line, as if they all belong there.
Also, the hortatory direct address, Mothers of America, let your children go to the movies, or heterosexuality. I mean, those kinds of addresses to large forces, which seems not exactly diction, but it's a kind of a poetic position which one does not expect in modern poetry.
And the subject matter, he has at least two poems, the Ave Maria, which begins Mothers of America, let your kids go to the movies, and another one called To the Film Industry in Crisis.
Right.
They're poems that are odes to Hollywood movies. And no one would be writing a poem to Hollywood movies if you were really following the Ten Commandments that I began to quote earlier.
Right. Also, and maybe we could extend that even further. Think about the poetry that is, the water surrounding this little island of O'Hara, Ashbery, Schuyler is a poetry that is so influenced by Eliot, and therefore its goal is this escape from personality, right? And what could be a more vivid, fleshy, breathing incarnation of personality? The real sense of enjoying the sound, the sense of humor, the friendships, the associations that I make because they charm and delight me and they charm and delight my friends.
And when he writes a love poem, he may call it Having a Coke with You. It's very, very American, and very intimate, very real. That's the title of one of his poems. It's a very nice poem.
I think there's a question or comment behind you here. Am I right? Were you wait? No, you were not. You were doing something else. Yes, sir.
One or both of you had intimated that there was a certain tension that O'Hara had with the idea of fame or notoriety. Was that the case? And in terms of his goal or aim of being Keatsian, he did have an early death, or was it a tragic death?
He died at 40, and it was a tragic death, and that he could very well be with us today. And it was a very weird, grotesque death because he was on Fire Island, where there are no cars allowed. Right. But someone was speeding on the beach, and O'Hara was on a beach buggy, a kind of trolley, that happened to break down. And so all the passengers were standing along the beach, and he was hit by this speeding drunk driver. And this happened in July of 1966. He was 40 years old. But we don't know what might have happened with his poetry. He was the central figure in this New York school. I mean, he was the figure who connected the poets to the painters. He was very chummy with painters. He loved dance and ballet. Went to the ballet all the time. Ashbery was a very shy personality. O'Hara was a very vital, in-your-face person, and he was the catalyst of all sorts of goings-on.
It sounds so affirmative. In terms of the first part of my question, he just doesn't sound like a the late David Foster Wallace's introspective concern.
Well, I would throw out to everyone, out there, is that we've read some of these poems. There is all this sense of celebration. I think that's the word you use, in this exuberance of daily life and all of his humor and his generosity and so forth. But do we detect? Is there a self-loathing? Is there an unusually tragic or vulnerable tone? And I raise this as a question. I do see it in places, and we talk of this early death. Were there? Well, I just throw it out. I wonder if anyone else reads it that way, or
he seems to have been a serious alcoholic. I think that during the last year, or maybe a little more than that, of his life, there was very little writing happening. When he was hit by that dune buggy on the beach, he was drunk at the time. He'd been out in the bars, and that would suggest an internal tension, yes, around self-negation. So sure, that's here, and some of that's got to be in the internalized stuff of the culture, all that would create shame for him and self-loathing. And you can feel it in the poems too. You feel sort of oscillation, but I mean that affirmation exists as a counter against its opposite, and that's so clear in A True Account of Talking to the Sun, as we were saying. I think it's clear elsewhere too. You can hear it in that Mayakovsky poem. Frequently, there's that. There are little glimmers of daydreaming about suicide. There are images of self-mutilation or damage to one's own body.
He wrote about suicide, but he did reject the idea. I mean, in one of his diary entries, he mounted a defense of living, and in a characteristic O'Hara way. And the mere thought that I might be missing out on something was enough. Something wonderful may happen, so I didn't want to miss it. But he was obviously very vulnerable. I mean, he's writing, why can't you drop someone else's for a change? Or the catastrophe of my personality.
What does it say? That I'm waiting for myself to return, that I can walk out on the streets again, or that's a very extreme state. That's a very extreme sort of vulnerable state. That he weaves that into. You're talking about the fluctuations of tone that he can weave in a suggestive, in a subtle way, not in a lull-like way, but in a subtle way, his vulnerability and his
right.
I think is all the more remarkable. Makes the poems.
But I think too about the pervasiveness of alcohol within the social culture in which he moved, and the notion of restraint was the way that we might readily identify what we would think of as the abuse of alcohol would be an unusual point of view in his moment. So one wonders what would have happened had he been able to step back from that, to change his behavior.
I had another to this point about the somber and the exuberance. Maybe I should follow my own advice.
You want to be famous.
Adam Gopnik curated a show. I think very crucial element in and you've all alluded to this. I'm just reiterating is the connection to MoMA and painting and so forth, and the sociology of it. But Adam Gopnik back in the 90s or the 80s curated that show at MoMA, the High-Low show, and you have the notion of somber and exuberant, and then you also have the notion of high culture and low culture. I think that's an element that's reflected both in painting, certainly in Larry Rivers and those and the pop painters, but earlier, using the detritus of human existence and making and the high and you mentioned Keats before, so I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about that, and if that's I think that O'Hara had an enormous impact in the same way that actually the pop artist did in taking the quotidian. And elevating it, and that's what I think I'm getting at here.
Yeah, was it in Meditations in an Emergency where he says, I want to be at least as alive as the vulgar?
Yes,
right.
That's
the
great line.
Kind of energy expressed in bad taste is something that's enormously attractive to him, right?
I'm looking for this passage about Keats here it is. I don't think of fame or posterity as Keats so grandly and genuinely did. Nor do I care about clarifying experiences for anyone or bettering, other than accidentally, anyone's state or social relation. nor am I for any particular technical developments in the American language simply because I find it necessary. What is happening to me, allowing for lies and exaggerations which I try to avoid, goes into my poems. I don't think my experiences are clarified or made beautiful for myself or anyone else. They're just there in whatever form I can find them. Well, I am mainly preoccupied with the world as I experience it, and at times when I would rather be dead, the thought that I could never write another poem has so far stopped me. I think this is an ignoble attitude. I would rather die for love, but I haven't. Now that sounds like him. There was a film made for Channel 13 in 1965 where they interviewed Frank in his office and taking phone calls, and which he did. He spoke on the phone all the time. In fact, he wrote that a poem could be a substitute for a phone call, and that he had that in mind. And it's a good point. It's true. I'm sure we clarified everything and aroused a lot of interest in this wonderful poet.
I hope so.
Okay, and there.